Hello and welcome to 11FS Spotlight. My name is David Brear. In this show, we shine a bit of a spotlight on the best and the brightest to understand what is it that gets them going, growing, and what do they really think the future of the industry will look like. On today's Spotlight, I'm delighted to be joined by Ken Hart, who is the CEO and founder of Snowdrop Solutions. How are you doing today, Ken?
Good. It's great to be here. Thanks.
Well, and you say great to be here. I mean, you're traveling around the world. You don't even live in London, do you? So you're visiting now as well.
I am half in London, half not. I think we're all been, because of COVID, sort of everything has been reset in hybrid working. But I've been recently in Singapore and Istanbul and Dubai, and it is nice to get back to the UK.
Very good, very good. Well, on today's show, what we're going to be doing is talking a little bit about Ken's career, take a bit of a mini deep dive into the importance of data enrichment and actually the place that has in today's fintech industry, and actually the place that has in creating trust more broadly as well. I know that's a topic that's really close to your heart as well. So maybe if we start off with a little bit of background for anybody who's unfamiliar, can you tell us a little bit more about the company?
Sure. So Snowdrop is a UK company. We're based here in London, with offices in Bath, Malaga, Spain, and in Singapore. Company is working very closely with Google Maps for almost 10 years. We work in 3 sectors. Real estate, so those of you in the UK are going to be familiar with Foxtons, Rightmove, Zoopla, large real estate companies. Travel, British Airways, Ryanair, Travelodge, Premier, et cetera, et cetera. And for about the last 5 years, financial services. So a lot of the original cool challenger banks like Starling and Monzo, but recently now more traditional banks like Nationwide, Chase here in the UK, and we've expanded outwards to places like Singapore, like Standard Chartered Bank, Nickel in France, et cetera, et cetera. So that's been really our growth engine for the last few years.
Very cool. And tell us a little bit more about your role specifically. What is the day-to-day look? It sounds like lots of airports potentially in that way.
No, fortunately, no, it's not that much. I guess part of my role is really, I would say, 3 things. One is figure out the direction we're going to be heading on. And what we really try and do is make, be it you're traveling, you're shopping, you're looking where to live and you're commuting, we want to sort of use maps and intelligent use of location data to make things just more intuitive. Whether you're looking at your bank statement, you're like, what is this transaction? I don't understand it. So we want to, or where should I live in COVID? Where should I go on holidays? We want to remove all those points of anxiety and confusion and just make it very intuitive for people. So they say, that was my transaction. I remember I was there.
Yeah. I mean, the context for financial services, we talk about digital riches, real-time, intelligent, contextual, like that context, that location part of it. I mean, it's increasingly important, isn't it? As we say, banking, financial services is increasingly experiential. Mm-hmm. So being at the point where you're enriching those things is pretty critical, isn't it?
I would think so. I mean, you talk about the journey people are on, the sort of the 1%. We would argue, I think, you said this best, you have 30 years been looking at messy data on paper, shrinking it down to messy paper on a PDF, and then shrinking that down further to mobile. We're like, no, it's still messy data. It's still incomprehensible. It's still stuff I don't understand. And so what we do is we take that messy data, we clean it up, we find that's the merchant name, that's its logo, and here it is on a map on how to get there if you want to get there. Yeah. Very simple, right? And it works. And what we've seen is that people have seen their calls to the call center where they complain and say, I've been hacked, I don't recognize this transaction. Banks like Nationwide Building Society has dropped by 30%. So, these are expensive calls to the call center. Yeah. We see the calls immediately come down, and we see people going, hey, you're transparent. I understand my transactions. I get it. You're a bank that I can engage more and be more trustworthy with.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it, that when you enrich the experience, people are looking for things they don't recognize rather than things that they do recognize in that way. And obviously, graphical nature or iconography around those things, the context of transactions, that's what really gives it that ability to scan things effectively, don't they? I mean, it's why statements were a table and you could scan through them, but actually humans register iconography or, location specific things much better than they do text in any way, shape or form. So, learning from that is Jason always says it's like really obvious when you say it out loud, but, putting that into practice is a lot harder than it should be in that way. But I guess from from your North Star when it comes to Snowdrop, where are you heading? What's your vision for where we sort of get to in that sense? Because, we're talking about things that, to your point, other industries that you work in are much more advanced than financial services in that sense. Financial services arguably is pretty much slow to every game when it comes to, experiential, cloud adoption, kind of all of these different things. But, the journey you guys have been on and seeing actually the collaborative way that you work with the industry, work with the organizations you play with, it kind of feels like you've got a vision of where this is all going.
I would like to think so. Yeah. So in part, it's about making things readily apparent, clear, and intuitive. So you just get it, right? A little background, we named the company after a guy called Dr. Jon Snow. And it wasn't the Game of Thrones, no, it wasn't the Anchorman on Channel 4 in the UK. It was a guy who lived, I think it was 1854, in Soho. There was an epidemic of, I think it was cholera at the time. But they went to the authorities and they said, oh, it's bad air. It's miasma or something like that. There's nothing the authorities could do. And this doctor sat down late at night and he drew a little map and he plotted with the black line where all the people were living that died. And he said, where's the source of water? Right in the middle. And they immediately showed that to, I think it was the reverend or the priest nearby, and they immediately went down and shut off the pump that led to the well. Epidemic stopped. And so there was no committee, there was no, 15 different people analyzing the data. It was just clear and transparent and intuitive. There's a direct correlation between the source of water and the deaths. And so, Snowdrop is named in part after Dr. Jon Snow. And if you go down to Broad Street today in Soho, you'll see a little blue plaque, dedicated to the guy.
Amazing.
Unfortunately, he died a pauper, and he's in Old Brompton Cemetery. But this is way before microscopes, right? So before you could actually have the evidence to determine, these sort of things, he was able to intuitively make a call to action and get things done.
Better data sets, right?
Right. So fast forward to where we are today, I'd like to think that the use of maps, when it works well, it's just as intuitive. Like, this is where you want to live. This is where you want to travel. These are your transactions. How do I get to be more green? Here's your spend. Here's how many of your current spend is at green merchants. And here's some merchants nearby if you wanted to, improve your spend on more green merchants.
Yeah. I mean, it is fascinating. And maybe if we sort of move into that and delve a little bit more in that sense, because as I was saying a second ago, financial services is sort of new to this game, really. It's been sort of numbers and tables for a very long time, but data enrichment more broadly. I mean, what does that mean in the context for anybody who's, is watching this, listening to this? What does that mean in the context of financial services in terms of what you bring to that game as well?
I'll talk about very specifically. So, for example, you'll take a messy, incomprehensible merchant name that you'll get in the authentication message, and it'll be something like Gromeka SLR, and you're like, what is that? What we'll do is we'll look that up along with the address. We'll say, no, that's an Italian restaurant called Mamma Mia. Here's the logo, and here it is. It's a restaurant. Click on a map and you can get there. So you go from incomprehensible data that was maybe the name of the franchise owner of Mamma Mia. Instead, we come back with what the consumer readily understands intuitively.
Well, and that goes to that edge case piece. I mean, recognizing things that people don't recognize, the bits that stand out. These are the things that people would call up to try and understand in more detail. Therefore, I guess to your point on avoiding calls, then if people recognize that transaction, that's going to be one less call and, 20 minutes on a waiting IVR system. So, experience goes up not just for the digital channels, but experience goes up for the brand holistically.
Very much so. And if you think about some of the new fintechs that we've been working with the last couple of years, one of the biggest problems they have is established themselves as a trusted authority. Who is this company?
Yeah.
We work with a company called Rebellion Pay in Spain. The biggest problem they had was not, believe it or not, creating the app and the digital bank. It was getting people to trust it, getting people to put their paycheck in there each month. And what they found is that when people could see the transactions, they go, oh, this is real. Yeah. I get it. That's where I'm spending my money. Whew. And you could sense that sense of relief, and that sort of transparency breeds trust. And if you're a new bank and you're trying to, or if you're a traditional bank trying to compete with the new banks, you need to reinvent yourselves as something that's more trustworthy and more transparent. And hopefully we play a small but important step to get there.
And what does sort of trust in that context mean, do you think? Because, I mean, we often say sort of people trust banks to not disappear, but they probably don't trust the banks to do the right thing for them. When it comes to that sort of micro level of trust, we're talking about, this isn't trust in like their marketing is the reality. It's trust in literally every transaction or every engagement in that way. You're sort of reinforcing the reason why people are with you, which for me is, big banks talk about trust like how much money are we spending above line, right? But actually you're talking about much more of a literally reinforcing it at every step.
Show me where I'm spending my money.
Yeah.
Then I can understand it intuitively.
Definitely.
And that really appeals to me, and it gives you a reason to go re-engage with your bank. And like I said, then you can do other things. You could say, hey, how much do you spend on your spending insights in your neighborhood? Or how much do you spend in that category compared to other people? And then the bank is in a position when they have that transparency to say, here's some recommendations we can make for you. So once you've established that transparency and trust, the bank is in a position to take them onto a broader part of that journey. And we're just doing the initial step.
Why do you think organizations struggle with that? The trust and transparency, this is
it's a big thing.
If your marketing and your day-to-day experiences are dramatically different, that gap causes it causes a lot of noise on social media for starters, but actually, it causes an issue for people, doesn't it? Why do you think that gap exists?
It's a good question. I think part of it is when you've been doing something that's so regulated for so long, you built in so many checklists and so many ways of doing things. It's all about process. And sometimes in the traditional banks that we'll talk to, the sort of consumer-centric view of the world is just often lost. It's just, we do it this way. Our process is this, our process is that. And, at some point it takes its toll and it gets whittled down into what was originally maybe a great idea for a new proposition, gets really diluted very quickly.
Yeah.
So I think part of it is just any size of any large organization has to deal with stuff like that. That probably plays a part of it. The other part is, if you think about coming back to travel and transportation and real estate, so we'll work with Zoopla, and Zoopla will say to me, this is the interface we want. We'll say, oh no, you want Airbnb. Why? It's a better interface. Here's how people search. You have the open map.
Yeah.
You have a list of apartments. As you move the map, the list moves. It's just more intuitive for people. Sure. And so there's a lot more best practice sharing often between, say, real estate and travel than other sectors and financial services, because they've been such in a dark hole in a deep cave for so long in terms of the user experience.
Yeah, it's an interesting one in that sense, because even if you're on something like that, scrolling around and seeing houses that are available in all of those different areas, again, that's another reinforcement of trust, though, because essentially you're seeing coverage, you're seeing, that experience is sort of self-reinforcing in that way as well, isn't it? I think there's something there for, again, financial services is often quite slow to those little, moments of pleasure or reinforcement moments in that sense. So, does that have such a negative effect, do you think? Even, an experience where there's a problem and I pick up the phone is one thing because, somebody in a call center can measure it. But how many, negative experiences can be avoided by enrichment in this way?
Let me give an example, not from financial services, and in some ways this is more readily apparent. We worked with a hotel chain that said, we have 75 hotels throughout the UK. You can click and go, that hotel, or let's say you want to go to the British Museum. You actually want to go to British Museum. The hotel is just where you're going to spend the night, right?
Yep.
You're going to go to a football game or grandma's house. The hotel is just some place nearby that's clean and decent, right? And what they found is that you would find a particular hotel, you would look at a room and say, oh, that's good. And then there would be a huge page-long text description how to get there. And that's called a bounce rate. People go, and they just go to Google Maps. Yeah. So think about it, you spent all this money to promote a website, show your inventory, go through, and at the very end of the booking process, because you had one long page of text written like, you're going to be reading this somehow in your car as you're driving down the M40 to get there, they'd say, I can't be bothered. Go to Google Maps, they probably found another hotel. Yeah. What we did is we got rid of all that text, and we said, click, blue line. Here's how to get there, 7-minute drive. Yeah. Once you drew the blue line, bookings went up by 23%.
Wow.
But that's a clear measurable outcome, right? And you talk about the user experience from a discombobulated long text message telling you driving directions compared to like putting it in the blue line and guiding people how to get there. So how do you take that experience that, say, was a real experience in the travel sector and bring that into banking. So that's what we're trying to do, right?
It's interesting. I mean, early days, this was, people would talk about, well, okay, this is physical objects. This is, I'm sure you had 1,000 people coming to you and going, okay, can we put all of my branches on a data set? And, it did it. But as you say, the world works so differently to that now in terms of, ongoing transactions or, mapping that night out you had and where you're like all of these things, which are, again, much more of financial services being a service. It's actually the ownership of it on a day-to-day basis rather than just the a product that you have. It's the reinforcement it gives you every day, isn't it? And that's the exciting part, isn't it? The enrichment can be so much more than just a static data set. It is, it's a living, breathing thing, and bringing that to life for the customers is it makes financial services just a little bit funner, doesn't it?
It should. If you think about it, it's such an essential part to all of our lives, right? So, to go from simple plotting, here's my ATM machine, here's my branch office, which is closed, by the way, right? Compared to like, here's where you're spending last week, here's that Saturday night where you don't remember what you were doing, here you could see your transactions, here's where you and your friends went out when you went on that group holiday. Not only could you share these transactions and see them on a map and make it more intuitive and shareable, that's a much more compelling experience, I would argue.
Definitely.
So moving from static plotting to contextualized experiences.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, when we talk about the future of financial services, we sort of say the fabric is shifting, the fabric is changing, and actually, the people who are creating that new fabric is essentially sort of charting a different trajectory for what financial services could be. And in many instances, it's coming back to some of the traditional values when it comes to people helping people be better off. And actually, from an algorithmic perspective, we're not a million miles away from that, are we? We're seeing, cars drive themselves now. We should be able to have algorithms that are helping people be better off in that sense. It's that sort of that democratization of a lot of things in that sense. I mean, where do you see financial services getting to more broadly? Is it continually dialing up to, be better and better experiences, or is it something else?
I think at some point there's a diminishing return in that. You know what I'm saying? So, you're going from, on some places, such a backwards, poor experience that just moving it up very quickly, in just a couple of weeks, you could go from incomprehensible data, growmecca.com, to Mamma Mia on a map. Oh, I remember now.
Sure.
So, but once you do that, then you could figure out, hey, here's all the, other things that you can do with that information. You could develop loyalty programs, you could do more reward programs, you could do more sustainable banking and stuff like that. When you manage 2 million transactions a month or 400 million transactions a month, you could start to say, make some nudges and where people could be more intelligent with their spend as well.
Yeah. It's interesting for us, when we talk about, I said about riches, the S is social. And I don't mean, post this transaction to Twitter or whatever, but when you've got data like that, understanding how your financial life compares to other people's financial lives, financial services is such a weird industry that we don't give anybody context of how well they're doing or anything that goes with that.
What normal means.
Exactly. Everybody sort of broadly thinks they're doing okay or really thinks they're not doing okay, but mostly you're usually wrong in both regards, aren't you? So, but it's interesting when you start getting, individual data sets that are so much richer because of things like what you're doing. How that comparative data comes around as well would be fascinating. I'm sure we can come up with some good ideas. Yeah. But we're rapidly running out of time, I'm afraid, and as we always do, we sort of like to ask more of an in-depth view from your perspective. You've had a great career, you've done some amazing things, you're leading a really awesome company. But actually, it's always nice to people who watch this, people who listen to this. There's a lot of people who are just getting into the game. They're getting started in terms of either financial services or fintech more broadly. What would be the piece of advice you'd give yourself if you could sort of give yourself a phone call and be like, hey, look out for this? What would the thing that you'd look for?
Marry well. That's the sort of the best advice I'd give anyone. And I'm not kidding about that. Surround yourself with good people, right? But the most important thing I would say is, if you're going to go in to do something, people ask me, why did you do Snowdrop? And they didn't do it to sort of, make a certain amount of money, or, it was more like you get to a point in one's career where you work with a lot of great people, and at least from my perspective, I got to a point in my career where I said, I saw a lot of dumb decisions being made. And you lose a bit of agency when you're in these large companies. And we work alongside some of the biggest companies out there. And you look at it and you go, maybe someone in California thought it was a good decision, but it's really not a smart decision. Sure. And so the ability to make your own autonomous decisions was important for me. And what I found is that working with like-minded people said, this is a great, this is a big problem. We have a good solution for it. And if it takes 3, 4, 5 years to solve it, then it's going to take 3, 4, 5 years to solve it. And so, the whole idea that you have to have a big idea, raise tons of money, build huge teams and grow like crazy, I'm actually not a big advocate of that. I'm much more of the opinion sometimes a bit more cautious, bootstrap as much as you can. I may have a lot of people who disagree with that, but that's been our solution so far because it enables us to invest long term in a place like Southeast Asia, right? We're not VC backed, we're not private equity backed. We've been profitable every quarter for 10 years in a row. Yeah. So when you have that sort of approach, you can approach things, hey, this may take 3, 4 years to get there. And so the advice I would give to anyone is give yourself the good people and the time to do a good job.
It's interesting, isn't it? When you build things to make sure that you're enjoying the journey as much as the destination in that way, then it is an exercise in creating an environment you want to be in, creating a business that you want to be part of, and that other people do as well. And when we've talked, over the last 4 or 5 years now, wow, that's kind of scary. It's that's something that's always really sort of come through is the passion for really solving these problems, but actually doing that with people rather than just at them in that way.
Yeah, it's not I think every company has its own culture to some extent, and when you work in the shadow of such big companies like Google and Visa and others, it's often more important to have your own very distinct culture.
Sure.
And I think, what I would say to anyone is if you're going to work in a place, you want to make sure the people that work for you look back 20 years from now and they're all still in touch. And I want them to be like, remember those crazy days at Snowdrop and stuff like that? And, you're able to forge really that band of brothers to some extent.
Yeah.
And I was fortunate enough, early in my career, I had that at places like Netscape. For those of you who don't remember Netscape, this is a long time ago. Anyone around here? No? No one. Oh, God. Okay. So this is the first internet browser company, right? But I'm still in touch with people I work with, sure, in the mid-90s.
Yeah.
And so having that sort of experience where people who know you've seen you evolve, but also know what your strengths and weaknesses are, play to people's strengths, surround yourself with people that complement you.
Yeah.
It's pretty cliche what I'm saying, but there's a lot of truth to it.
Well, Netscape was a movement, though. It was a movement of, democratizing the internet, taking the internet to everywhere and having an alternative to the mainstream that actually, arguably is far better equipped, sometimes product and distribution, though, in that way. Microsoft was pretty good at distribution, but there's a whole antitrust podcast we can do around distribution at another point.
Through that, but to some extent, I look at the digital banks as like the internet service providers of the mid-90s.
Yeah.
And what happened, fast forward to 2000, it was all gobbled up by BT, had its mobile arm, internet arm, and stuff like that. So yes, I pretend a lot of consolidation in this space, but it will change.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on and spending time with us. And thank you for all of the bits and bobs that you've done over the 4 or 5 years with what we've been having the conversations for. Sadly, that's all the time that we've got today. Where can people learn a little bit more about you and all the good stuff that you do at Snowdrop?
Don't hesitate to reach out to us on snowdropsolutions.co.uk or on LinkedIn is probably the best way to get a hold of me. Very
cool. That's all we've got for this week. Make sure you follow 11FS on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, pretty much everywhere at this stage, wherever you're looking and finding cool stuff. And if you do enjoy the show, then do subscribe to the 11FS YouTube channel, where you can also catch up on all the previous episodes. Have a great week, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you, David.
Awesome.
None of you know who Netscape is?